since December 19th, 1944. Snow fell heavily over the dense Ardennes forest, masking the sound of engines and the shuffle of thousands of German boots pushing through the cold, silent terrain. Operation Watch on the Rhine had been in motion for days, and morale among the Wehrmacht troops was rising. They believed they had surprised the Allies. The early success of the German counteroffensive gave many soldiers hope that the war could still turn in their favor. Among those marching in the white blur of snow was Private Lucas Meyer. He was just 19, barely more than a boy, but already hardened by years of war. His hands were numb from the frost, his breath rising in clouds. Around him were tanks, artillery, and men, all part of a massive push toward the Meuse River. Lucas, like many others, believed they were about to crush the weak Allied lines and break through. Intelligence had told them the Americans were scattered and ill-prepared. The weather grounded their aircraft. It felt like the perfect time. But deep inside the trees, far ahead of their column, the Americans were not as clueless as the Germans believed. In the snow-covered hills sat the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, a mixed unit of black and white American soldiers. They had received reports of German movement and had already zeroed in their coordinates. Most of them were exhausted, running low on supplies, and frozen to the bone. But they had one advantage the Germans didn't know about: newly equipped proximity fuses for their 155 mm shells. Captain Roy Jefferson, a no-nonsense man from Mississippi, stood near the artillery crews, watching as they prepared the next barrage. He knew this fuse technology was still largely unknown to the Germans. Unlike traditional shells that exploded on impact or by timer, these new fuses could sense when they were near a target, detonating mid-air with brutal accuracy. It was a game-changer. "Make every shot count," Jefferson muttered, eyeing the advancing blips on the radar reports they'd received through crackling radio transmissions. "They don't even know what's coming." Farther down the road, Lucas and his unit reached an open field between two rows of trees. Snow lay untouched, thick like a white blanket. Their commander ordered them to fan out. The forest gave way to clearer terrain, and the tanks rumbled ahead. No one saw any signs of resistance. No rifle shots, no movement. It looked like the Allies had truly abandoned the line. Then, without warning, the sky above them cracked open. A thunderous roar echoed through the trees as shells began exploding. Not in the dirt, but mid-air, just meters above their heads. The proximity fuses had activated, sensing the presence of soldiers below and detonating with terrifying precision. Shrapnel rained down in lethal waves. Lucas hit the ground hard, his ears ringing. Screams filled the forest. Bodies dropped all around him, some torn apart, others twitching in agony. The tanks, once the pride of the column, became coffins as blasts disabled their crews. In less than 2 minutes, an entire battalion's front line was shredded. "They're using airbursts," one German officer yelled in panic. "This isn't normal artillery." Lucas crawled behind a tree stump, trying to find cover, but there was no escape from the metal hail. Each shell exploded just high enough to maximize the kill radius. The Germans had walked straight into a trap they couldn't see. In the American lines, Captain Jefferson watched through his binoculars. "Direct hit," he said calmly. "Reload and fire again. Don't let up." The artillery teams obeyed, shell after shell whistling into the sky. Their rhythm was steady, their aim deadly. The proximity fuses did the rest. By the time the German survivors began retreating from the clearing, the snow was no longer white. It was stained red, filled with broken weapons, destroyed armor, and twisted bodies. Lucas survived, barely, but his face was frozen in horror. He had seen battles before, but never something like this. Never death from above with such cold, scientific efficiency. They had not even seen the enemy. Only the sky lighting up and the ground littered with death. He didn't know the name of the weapon. He only knew one thing: Whatever had hit them was not human. It was like the heavens themselves had turned against them. Lucas stumbled through the smoke and snow, his helmet missing, ears deafened by the endless concussions. The few who survived with him were in shock, dazed, bloodied, muttering prayers or just mumbling nonsense. The trees, once their cover, were now blackened sticks. Even nature seemed mutilated. His boots crunched over bodies, shattered equipment, and broken dreams. They regrouped behind a ridge, maybe 30 of them from what was once over 200 men. Their officer, Lieutenant Kruger, was among the dead, cut in half by one of the mid-air blasts. No one took command. They were leaderless, stunned, and terrified of stepping back into the open. "What the hell was that?" one soldier asked, eyes wide, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "That's not just artillery." Lucas said nothing. He couldn't. His throat was dry, his brain spinning. He felt like a ghost that had just walked out of hell. What haunted him most wasn't the sight of the dead. He'd seen that before. It was the precision. The shells had known exactly when to explode. There was no randomness, no chance. It was as if something above had judged them and executed them without mercy. Meanwhile, inside the American command post, Captain Jefferson removed his gloves and looked over the latest field report. Radio intercepts confirmed it. German radio chatter was in disarray. Panic, confusion, disbelief. "Looks like the Krauts just met their first real taste of the new fuse," said Sergeant Miller. Grinning, Jefferson didn't smile. "They won't stay shocked forever," he replied. "Once they figure it out, they'll adapt. We need to make sure they don't get that chance." Back in the German lines, the High Command was already reacting. Reports flooded in about phantom artillery, shells that never touched the ground, yet killed with brutal efficiency. The term Luftminen, air mines, began circulating among the troops. Superstition took hold. Some claimed the Americans were using new chemicals or even supernatural weapons. But one man, Colonel Dietrich Stahl, wasn't interested in superstition. He was stationed at a forward command post and demanded answers. A veteran of both world wars, he'd seen enough slaughter to know the difference between panic and strategy. He summoned his senior surviving officers, and Lucas was among those chosen to give a direct report. His presence wasn't because of rank. He simply survived when so many hadn't. Inside the makeshift bunker, Lucas stood stiff as Colonel Stahl studied him with cold, calculating eyes. "Describe the attack," Stahl demanded. Lucas swallowed, his voice hoarse. "The shells didn't hit the ground. They exploded above us. The air itself rained metal. It wasn't random. Every blast felt intelligent." "Intelligent?" Stahl scoffed. "Are you saying the Americans are using thinking weapons?" "No, sir," Lucas said quickly. "I mean, it was like the shells sensed us." There was no time to react. No warning. Stahl leaned back, silent for a moment. Then he said, "Very well, dismissed." After Lucas left, Stahl turned to his aide. "Tell Berlin we've encountered a new type of artillery fuse, probably radar-based. That explains the detonation pattern. It's not magic. It's science." Still, despite his rational explanation, the morale across the German lines began to rot. Whispers spread faster than orders. The Americans have ghost shells. The sky is cursed. Even the snow burns now. Lucas tried to sleep that night under a canvas tarp, snowflakes falling quietly, masking the horror below. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the shrieking whistle and felt the concussive blast above his head. Sleep didn't come, only silence. And guilt. The next morning, reinforcements arrived. New faces, fresh troops, young, smiling. They hadn't seen what Lucas saw. One of them, a cheerful Bavarian with rosy cheeks, nudged Lucas and said, "They say we've got the Allies on the run, eh?" Lucas didn't respond. He simply looked at the sky, still gray, still quiet, and whispered under his breath, They're not running. They're waiting. By December 23rd, 1944, the snow had turned crusted and hard, stained with a permanent rust color that no one dared call by its name. German High Command was still issuing orders for another push, still demanding the impossible. Retake Bastogne, crush the Allied center, drive through to Antwerp. On paper, it looked achievable. On the ground, the men knew better. In reality, they were walking corpses with rifles. Some still obeyed out of duty, others because they didn't know what else to do, and some, like Lucas, simply moved forward because staying still felt worse, like waiting for the next shell to find you. His squad was now 3 men, and none of them spoke unless they had to. Their new orders were to flank through a small woodland ridge and set up forward observation near the outskirts of a bombed-out village. It sounded simple, but nothing was simple anymore. Not when the sky had turned against them. As they crept through the trees, Lucas stopped suddenly. The forest felt wrong, not just silent. It was dead. No birds, no wind, just an oppressive weight in the air, like the ground itself was warning them. Then, a faint whistle. Just one. He threw himself flat as the air above shattered. The proximity fuse detonated 5 meters overhead. The shell hadn't aimed for the ground. It aimed for presence. A burst of fire, steel fragments slicing sideways like invisible razors. The soldier behind Lucas didn't even scream. His body just folded, cut open mid-stride. The third man tried to run. Another shell burst mid-air, and he went down, twitching. Lucas pressed his face into the frozen dirt, hands over his helmet, waiting for the next breath to be his last. But nothing came. Just smoke, just silence. He stood up slowly, ears ringing, vision blurry. All he could hear was his own heartbeat and the crunch of ice under his boots. The trees were scarred again. The forest now held 2 more names. He didn't even look back. He stumbled forward, alone. Meanwhile, far behind the lines, Colonel Stahl stood before a group of Wehrmacht generals in a makeshift command post, his voice firm, but his tone cracked with desperation. We are losing discipline. Not just troops, not just land, but the will to fight. They believe the Americans have a weapon that thinks. That seeks them, one general scoffed. What, you want us to tell them it's just radar and science? That won't stop the bleeding? No, Stahl snapped. But ignoring it won't either. These proximity fuses, they change everything. It's not artillery anymore. It's psychological extermination. Another officer leaned forward, rubbing his temples. What do you propose? Surrender? Stahl said nothing. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because he already knew the truth. They were standing inside the last illusion of control. Back across the lines, Captain Jefferson leaned against his jeep, sipping cold coffee as trucks brought in more proximity-fused shells. He watched his men prep artillery like clockwork. Calm, efficient. No one rushed. No one shouted. They didn't need to, because they were winning without ever seeing the enemy. A young corporal walked up. Sir, do you think they understand yet? What these fuses really are? Jefferson didn't look at him. He just said, they understand enough. And indeed, they did. In one abandoned farmhouse near St. Vith, a German soldier carved words into the frozen wall with a pocket knife before shooting himself through the head. They know where we are, even when we don't move. Lucas eventually reached the edge of the village, alone, frostbitten, hallucinating from cold and hunger. He dropped into a crater, trying to catch his breath. Overhead, the sky was a blank, steel gray. No planes, no birds, no sun, just silence. Then a faint click from the distant ridge. He knew the sound now. A shell had just left an American gun. He stared at the sky. He didn't run. He didn't move. He just whispered, "Please, not now." But the fuse didn't care what he said. The shell burst before Lucas could finish his breath. A brutal explosion mid-air, not 10 feet above the crater. The blast flattened the trees around him, kicked dirt and bone into the sky, and erased every sound but a high-pitched ring inside his skull. But somehow, he was still alive. He lay there half buried in frozen soil, blood pouring from his ears, chest heaving. Shrapnel had torn through the rim of his helmet and grazed his shoulder. But it hadn't finished him. Not yet. He didn't know how long he stayed there. Minutes, hours. Time had lost meaning. His only sense was that the sky had tried again to kill him and failed. That felt like a curse, not a miracle. He crawled out of the crater like a wounded animal, dragging his body toward the ruins of the village. Most of the houses were roofless, some burned to the ground. He found shelter in a half-collapsed barn with no doors and a floor full of ash. He sat in the corner, pulled his coat tighter, and just listened. No shelling, no footsteps, no voices, just wind whispering through splintered wood. He wasn't alone long. A shadow appeared at the entrance, rifle raised, uniform torn, but unmistakably German. Lucas reached for his weapon, but the man just lowered his own and stepped inside without a word. He sat down on the opposite wall and looked at Lucas with the same eyes he'd seen too many times now. Eyes that didn't care about rank or sides anymore. Eyes of the broken. "They're hunting ghosts," the man finally said. Lucas blinked. "What?" "The Americans," he muttered. "They don't fight us. They hunt us. Like ghosts. We don't even see them anymore. Just the sky." "Watching," Lucas didn't respond, because deep down, he agreed. He had seen the effect of bullets, of bombs, of tank shells. But this was different. These proximity fuses weren't just a new weapon. They were judgment. From the barn, he watched the horizon burn again that night. Faint flashes of artillery in the distance, one after another. And every time the sky lit up, he flinched. His muscles remembered before his mind did, across the line. Captain Jefferson's men were celebrating. Word had spread that the Germans had begun pulling back from multiple positions, some without even fighting. In one sector, American scouts had found over 60 German rifles left neatly stacked in surrender, with no soldiers in sight. Desertion. Breakdown. Collapse. Sergeant Miller walked into the command tent with a grin. "Sir, the krauts are cracking wide open. Bastogne's holding, and they're calling for backup that's never coming." Jefferson nodded. "Keep the pressure. Keep the shells coming. Every hour. Don't give them room to breathe." Miller hesitated. "Sir, you ever feel like this isn't war anymore?" Jefferson looked at him. "What do you mean?" The sergeant rubbed the back of his neck. "I mean, this fuse thing, it's too easy. Too clean. Like we don't even have to see them to win. It's like we're not fighting people anymore, just shadows." Jefferson's face stayed still, cold, calculated. "That's how you win wars," he said. But even he knew the truth. This wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about sending a message that could never be forgotten. Back in the village, Lucas lit a cigarette with shaking hands. The other soldier, whose name he still didn't know, had fallen asleep or passed out. He wasn't sure which. Lucas stared at the smoke curling toward the rafters and whispered to himself, "We're not fighting anymore. We're just waiting our turn." Suddenly, a distant sound, not shelling, but something far worse, a rumble. American tanks. Getting closer. He scrambled to his feet, looked through the barn's broken window, and saw headlights slicing through the forest mist. Infantry following behind, slow and steady. They weren't hiding anymore. They didn't need to. They knew the Germans were too shattered to fight. Lucas had one bullet left in his rifle. He stared at it. For a moment, the temptation was strong, stronger than the cold, the pain, the fear. But then something shifted inside him. Not strength, not courage, defiance. He wouldn't die like an animal in a corner. Not by his own hand. Not yet. He picked up his rifle and whispered into the night, "Come and find me, then." The snow had stopped falling, but the cold had grown crueler, sinking into bones and stealing the feeling from fingers. German soldiers shuffled through the slush, their boots soaked, uniforms stiff with ice. The trees were quieter now, as if the forest itself had mourned the dead. But the silence wasn't peace, it was dread. Something was coming, and they all felt it. Lucas sat on a broken crate, sharpening his bayonet slowly, not because he needed to, but because it gave his hands something to do, something to stop the shaking. Around him, the new recruits laughed, smoked, and played cards. They had no idea what the Americans had unleashed. He didn't bother warning them. They wouldn't believe him. Further behind the front, Colonel Stahl had gathered with a small intelligence unit, studying intercepted Allied communications. What little they decoded confirmed his suspicion. The Americans had begun deploying proximity fuses on a large scale. The fuses, which used miniaturized radar signals, detonated artillery shells when they came near a target. They didn't need impact. They didn't need luck. They just needed proximity. "This is not just a technological advantage," Stahl muttered, slamming a fist on the table. "This is psychological warfare." And he was right. The Americans didn't need to break the German army. They only had to make them believe they were already broken. That night, the German command ordered a second push through a narrow valley flanked by high ridges. The plan was simple: overwhelm the weakened American line and secure a supply road before dawn. It would be a night assault. Darkness was supposed to be their advantage, but the Americans were ready again. From high in the ridges, the 969th Field Artillery Battalion waited. They had received the coordinates through scouts and intercepts. They knew the Germans would come through the valley like cattle through a slaughter chute. Captain Jefferson gave the order without emotion. Load them all with proximity. No delays. The first wave of Germans moved quietly through the frozen corridor, whispering among themselves, their breath forming clouds in the moonlight. Lucas was among them again, this time marching in the middle of the formation. His nerves screamed with every step. His instincts told him they were walking into death. The first shell came without sound. There was no whine, no warning, just a flash, a hollow boom, and then blood. It exploded 10 feet above the lead unit, and it ripped men apart like paper dolls. Before the screams even reached Lucas's ears, 3 more detonated in the air, perfectly spaced. Not a single shell hit the ground. All of them burst overhead. The night lit up with orange flashes, each one followed by chaos. Men scattered in all directions. Officers yelled orders that were lost in the thunder. One soldier ran straight into a tree, blinded by panic. Another crawled beneath a wagon, only to be shredded by a second blast that tore the cart apart from above. Lucas threw himself into a ditch, his mouth filled with mud and snow, as shrapnel tore through the night like angry hornets. One man screamed, "It's the sky! They've mined the sky!" Another dropped his rifle, crying like a child, "We're already dead! We're already dead!" Lucas pressed his face to the frozen dirt. His thoughts weren't of bravery or duty anymore. All he could think of was his mother's voice and how warm his village had once felt before the war. He stayed there until the shelling stopped. It lasted only 5 minutes, but it felt like forever. When he finally looked up, the valley had turned into a charnel pit. Dozens of bodies lay twisted and broken. The snow had turned black and red. Some survivors limped away, coughing, dragging the wounded. Others simply sat down in the blood-soaked snow, eyes wide, weapons forgotten. Behind the ridge, Jefferson watched through binoculars. "They walked right into it," he muttered. "Just like we planned." Sergeant Miller lit a cigarette and said, "You think they'll try again?" Jefferson lowered his glasses. "Not without losing more than just men. We're not just killing soldiers now. We're killing faith. And that's exactly what was happening. By the end of the night, the German offensive had stalled again. Not because of tanks, not because of infantry, but because of fear. Raw, suffocating fear. Lucas sat under a pine tree, shaking, staring at his hands. They were covered in blood, but not his own. He didn't feel like a soldier anymore. He didn't even feel like a human. He felt hunted. By the morning of December 21st, 1944, the once proud German advance had become a scattered trail of broken trucks, burning tanks, and blood-soaked snow. The commanding generals issued new orders, trying to salvage momentum. But momentum doesn't obey orders, not when your men are too afraid to walk into open ground. Lucas hadn't spoken a word since the ambush in the valley. His squad had been reduced to 5, most of them walking ghosts. Their eyes darted toward the treetops with every sound. Even the wind brushing branches above made men flinch. The proximity fuses weren't just killing soldiers, they were killing time, sanity, and sleep. Night and day blurred together. No one wanted to move forward, and no one dared retreat. They were stuck between German officers barking commands and an American enemy that never needed to show its face. At the front line, rumors spread fast. A captured American radio operator had supposedly bragged, "You don't need to see us, we can feel you." Whether it was true or not didn't matter. Soldiers believed it. Some began refusing to march during daylight. Others faked injuries or wandered off into the forest alone, hoping to be captured rather than obliterated. In a frozen barn near the village of Foy, Lucas sat with his remaining squad. A fire crackled weakly in a dented metal bucket. The warmth didn't help. Nothing could. "I heard someone say their artillery listens now," one young soldier muttered. "Like it hears you breathing and explodes when you're afraid." "No," Lucas replied suddenly, his voice low and gravelly. "It doesn't need to hear you. It just needs to know you're there." They all looked at him. It was the first thing he'd said in hours. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. Across the lines, the Americans kept firing, but they weren't wasting shells. Every shot was calculated. Every blast meant to terrify as much as kill. Proximity fuses weren't cheap, but their impact was priceless. The psychological reports from the field spoke of increased German deserters. American intelligence was intercepting panicked radio calls, some from commanders begging for air support, others screaming into static for artillery to stop. The Germans were breaking from the inside out. Captain Jefferson was in his tent, reading a fresh report from Army intelligence. It listed the staggering number of confirmed kills from his battalion alone. Over 400 enemy troops in 3 days, all without a single shot fired from enemy rifles in return. "They're bleeding out without a fight," Sergeant Miller said, scanning the report over his shoulder. Jefferson nodded. "They're not soldiers anymore. They're targets," but even he didn't smile, because he understood what this war had become. It wasn't about courage or heroism now. It was about fear. Cold, silent fear that fell from the sky. Back in the German ranks, Colonel Stahl arrived at the remnants of a frontline post, expecting to find an organized defense. Instead, he walked into a graveyard. Dead horses, burned crates, mangled uniforms. A field kitchen still steaming, the cooks gone. No one had even touched the food. He slammed his gloves on a crate and roared, "Where are the men? Who's in charge here?" A thin, trembling voice spoke from behind a splintered wooden door. "They're gone, Herr Oberst. Some ran, they never stood up again." Stahl turned and saw Lucas, rifle across his lap, sitting in the cold like a statue, eyes hollow. Stahl walked up, grabbed him by the collar. "Are you a soldier or a coward?" Lucas looked him dead in the eyes and said, "I'm whatever they haven't killed yet." Stahl let go. No threats, no punishment, because deep down, even he knew this wasn't a failure of discipline. This was something else, something they couldn't fight with orders or bullets. That night, In a nearby village church taken over as a field hospital, the wounded screamed in their sleep. Nurses tried to calm them, but most woke up in cold sweats, crying about metal rain, about invisible fire, about watching their friends explode into dust. Lucas lay on a wooden floor under a bloodied blanket, staring at the ceiling. Every crack in the old wood above him looked like a shell just waiting to burst. Every creak sounded like death. And still, the shelling continued. The Americans didn't stop, because why would they? They didn't need to see the Germans. They only needed them to exist. Christmas Eve. But in the shattered village where Lucas waited, there were no carols, no candles, no warmth. Only ruins, silence, and snow crusted in dried blood. The wind howled through broken walls like the cries of the dead. The tanks rolled closer. American Shermans, their tracks grinding over snow and rubble, pushing straight into the ruins without hesitation. Infantry followed behind, rifles up, eyes scanning, not for resistance, but for survivors. They didn't expect to fight anymore. The Germans had broken days ago. Lucas watched them from a hole in the second floor of a shelled building. His hands were frozen stiff on his rifle. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. His body screamed for warmth, food, sleep, but something deeper kept him still. Not hatred, not loyalty, just instinct, the kind that refuses to kneel, even when there's no point standing. Below, an American patrol entered the square. 8 men, moving carefully, talking, laughing even. They felt safe. Why wouldn't they? The artillery had already done the work. Lucas looked through his cracked scope and focused on the lead soldier. He didn't pull the trigger. He just watched. Because now, for the first time, he saw it from the other side. The calm confidence, the clean gear, the warmth in their coats. They were not afraid. They had never felt what he had felt. They didn't know what it was like to hear the air scream and realize death could fall without warning. They had the fuse. They were the fuse. He lowered the rifle, and then, downstairs, something moved. Not the other German soldier. He was already dead, sometime in the night, frozen stiff under a blanket of snow. No, this was someone else. Footsteps, boots, soft, careful. Lucas spun around, raised his weapon, and stared into the face of a young American soldier. Maybe 18. Rifle raised, eyes wide. Both froze. Neither fired. They stared at each other across a dozen feet of broken wood and shattered war, breathing heavy, hearts pounding. Then the American said, barely above a whisper, "You don't have to." Lucas's finger tightened slightly on the trigger. The American didn't blink. "I won't shoot if you don't." Seconds passed like hours. Lucas lowered the rifle. Not out of fear, not mercy. Just emptiness. He had nothing left to fire for. The American nodded, lowered his weapon too, and slowly backed out of the room. For a moment, there was peace. Then, behind the building, a shell screamed into the sky. Not aimed at Lucas, not aimed at soldiers, but at the edge of the forest, where a fresh German company had just arrived. Reinforcements, young, new faces, unaware of what lay ahead. They'd walked straight into the grid. The shell burst overhead. Proximity fuse. A perfect murderous blossom of fire and steel. Lucas heard the screams, saw the orange light flash against the walls, and fell to his knees. His body trembled. Not from fear, from fury, from helplessness, because it would never stop. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not until there was nothing left to kill. Down below, the Americans didn't even flinch. They kept moving, checking houses, rounding up the last German stragglers. A few hands went up. A few didn't get the chance. And high above, the sky remained gray and blind. It didn't choose sides. It simply punished motion. Lucas sat with his back against the wall, rifle across his lap, and whispered to no one. "We thought the end would be thunder. But it came in silence. The war was still going, but for him, it was already over. 2 days after Christmas, the village was silent again. But it was a different silence now. Not the kind before shell fire, but the kind that comes after something has died, and the world doesn't bother mourning it. American flags now flew from the corners of shattered buildings. Tanks idled in the streets like sleeping beasts. The civilians, what few remained, had begun creeping out from cellars, blinking against the pale light, their homes in ruins, their families halved. Lucas had been captured without a fight. They found him sitting in the same room, rifle unloaded, hands resting on his knees. He didn't speak when they ordered him to stand, didn't flinch when they patted him down. He just followed, blank-eyed, as they marched him to a makeshift POW camp in a frozen field beyond the town. But the war hadn't left him. It lived in his spine, his jaw, the tremor in his fingers. It clung to him like frostbite. The Americans didn't mock him. They didn't beat him. They barely looked at him. They had won, and they knew it. There was no glory in kicking someone who had already lost everything. Inside the wire fence of the camp, Lucas sat with dozens of other prisoners, most of them quiet, broken in a way that uniforms couldn't hide. Their boots were torn, their hands bandaged with rags. They didn't talk about the battles. They didn't talk at all. One man muttered, "The Americans didn't beat us." "Their weapons did," another corrected him. "Not the weapons, the sky." That same day, Captain Jefferson visited the forward positions with a convoy of officers. He moved through the village like a man walking through his own legacy. The artillery crews saluted as he passed, the man who had called the fire that shattered the Bulge, that halted Hitler's last gamble in its tracks. But Jefferson didn't smile. As he walked through a bombed-out house, he noticed something scratched into the wall with the butt of a rifle. 3 words in rough, childlike German. Der Himmel hört. The sky listens. He stared at it longer than he should have. That night, in the camp, Lucas sat by a barrel fire among other prisoners. Snow fell gently, like the war was trying to pretend it hadn't happened. A Red Cross worker handed him a cup of soup. Warm. Real. He took it, nodded, and held it between his hands for a long time before drinking. It tasted like something from before the war. Like life. A young American guard watched him from the fence, the same soldier who had spared him in the village. He gave Lucas a slight nod. Lucas returned it. There was no hatred left between them, just exhaustion. Later, lying under a torn blanket, Lucas looked up at the sky. It was the same sky, the one that had watched him crawl, hide, scream, the one that rained death, not because it hated him, but because it could. And yet now, it was calm, clear, stars visible. He remembered the first time he'd seen proximity shells in action, how they'd burst not above trenches, but inside his thoughts. The fear hadn't come from what he could see. It came from what he couldn't escape, the feeling that he was being hunted by something too precise to be human. And yet, he had survived. Not because of luck, but because sometimes survival is the only rebellion left. Far in the distance, another barrage rumbled, not near them, but somewhere else. Somewhere the war still clawed for inches of ground and bodies to bury. But for Lucas, it was just thunder now, background noise to the end of a nightmare. He closed his eyes and whispered a final thought, not in prayer, not in pain, just a truth he had earned. You don't fear the enemy when you've already seen the sky turn against you. The war would end soon, but for those, like Lucas, the ones who had walked through proximity fire and lived, the silence that followed would always sound like an artillery fuse waiting to finish what it started.